借主中途之火照，这是国家的思想，在下羔羊分盘尝，见你身体醉在不长，我们长有这望望，真主真人万事常有。也心生化产生了，就以产生血中藏，全心无一主荣光。见你召唤耶稣之王，无限神奇万人望。阿门。
Okay, so Panjalingua in Chinese. Next, we have a talk by Mr. Carl Marburg to talk to us about. Try again. Next, we have a talk by Mr. Carl to talk to us about Our Lady of Fatima. Mr. Carl is currently touring the Diocese of Dallas until the 24th of June with the international program Virgin Statue from Fatima, Portugal. Carl makes his home in the Diocese of Gary, Indiana, and has been traveling as a spokesperson for Our Lady of Fatima since 1993. He has visited thousands of parishes over 30 countries. In teaching the Fatima messages, Mr. Marburg emphasized the importance of the Eucharistic aspect of Our Lady's plan, peace plan from heaven. And so let's welcome Mr. Carl.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you for arranging this, and I'm very happy to be asked to be a little bit part of it. And I noticed that the podium is out here in a safe place. I speak in churches every day, and you guys didn't know it, but they usually have a trap door there. And so if you say the wrong thing, well, I'm really safe right here. So one day I mentioned that, and the usher that's there every Sunday, he said, "You have to tell me where that string is because our priest talks too long sometimes." But Eucharist, isn't that so dear to our hearts? The Panjalingua reminds me when we were kids, before the Vatican Council, every parish would have a 40 hours devotion, and not all at the same time of the year. And the neighboring priests would, I lived in very small communities with very small parishes, but the priests would get together for the procession around the church at the closing of 40 hours. And it's something you could not forget as a child if you were there for that closing. And the priest singing Panjalingua round and around the church. It must have had 20 verses. All Latin. We had no idea what any of it was said. But regarding Fatima and the Eucharist, you know Mary appeared first on May 13th. And do you wonder why she chose that particular day? The scholars that study these things notice that on May 5th, May 5, 1917, the Pope Benedict XV, who was the Pope during First World War, had been sending letters to the faithful, praying for an end to the First World War, a solution to the political problems and all that. And on the 5th of May, he issued another letter and saying, since all human means seem to fail, let us turn to the Mother of God and ask for her intercession and a solution to these political problems causing so much carnage. And on that day, he added the title Lady of Peace. Queen of Peace to the Litany of Loretto. And that's the first time that title was ever in the Litany of Loretto. On the ninth day, it sounds like a novena, doesn't it? On the ninth day that title was part of the litany was May 13th. And she came over in Portugal on that day. And so that's one thing. But there's another thing or two that you can notice. 13 is an unlucky number, right? Well, us Westerners all think it was unlucky for the devil that day. But May 13th at that time, of course, on our religious calendars was the feast of Our Lady of the Eucharist. And I know most of the Fatima people don't have time to look at those minor details, but for you folks, she came on her feast day of the Eucharist, Our Lady of the Eucharist. It was a Sunday, though, that day, and so it would not have been celebrated in the morning Mass, Sunday liturgy, you know. But perhaps those people up there in that hill country of Portugal, a few of them learned to read fairly well. Others just learned how to count money, and that's about all they went to school for. And those three children, even the 10-year-old, had not been in school yet at that time. And so that for the girls, some never went to school. Most tried to learn to read by 1917. And the boys a little more with mathematics and so on. But it's very different in our culture. Now, Fatima didn't start with May 13th. Lucia, the older one, the one that was the leader of that gang, she had her first mystical experience at her first communion. And that was when she was only 6 years old. And there's another miracle there, because although Pope Pius X had already for 10 years or 15 before that, had been teaching that First Communion should be at the age of reason instead of 11, 12, 13 as it had been, to reduce the age for First Communion. And so they had brought it down to about 9 more or less, and not all the way down to the 7 or 8 that the Pope wanted out there in the hills there. And so she had participated in the studies and preparation with her older sister, and with her mother being one of the CCD teachers there, preparing the students for First Communion. And so at age 6, she knew all the answers and she wanted First Communion. And of course, the priests and others thought she wanted a pretty white dress is what she really wanted, the idea of First. They were wrong. She understood. And she had such an understanding that although Father Ferreira there, he said, can't, wait till next year, maybe next year. And he had a visiting priest, a kind of a retired age priest, had come up there to help him with the First Communion celebration. And so he went and got that good old priest and he said, talk to this little kid here, tell her why she can't receive First Communion. And so he examined her. I forget his name, you could look it up, I suppose. But he examined her, came back to Father Ferrer and said, there's no reason you cannot deny her communion. And so she received First Communion at age 6. And in fact, as I said, she was receiving with 9-year-olds and 10s. But at that time then of her First Communion, this old priest had told her how to pray after she received Jesus and to give her life to Jesus. And then she should go over to the image of Mary and turn herself over to her second mother, Mary, and ask Mary to keep her always pure and chaste and always close to Jesus. And she dutifully did that, and the statue came to life at that time. The rather dull statue, not a nice, new, beautiful one, well painted or anything, came to life for her and responded to her with a smile and a word or two. And so she had then this understanding that there is mystical experience at age 6. She scarcely shared that with anybody. She was a very private person, actually, even at such a young age. And so then the next mystical thing that happened to her was with the angel appearing to her. And most of you all know the story of the 3 apparitions of the angel during the spring, summer, and fall of 1916. However, in the fall of 15, she was out in the fields at that time with a couple of other kids. And they saw this cloud come from the east, I think it was, coming down out of the sky toward and kind of stand across the horizon above the trees. stopping on a tree, and she said that cloud seemed to take the figure of a person, just a beautiful white cloud. And she looked at it a little bit, and her friends did, and then it disappeared. And so it was fascinating, and it was enough that it planted a memory that years later she was recalling it. But that was that. She was not inclined to share that with anybody, and apparently her two girlfriends that had been there with her either didn't share it or was passed off as nothing. Spring of 1916, then she had the two with her. That was the very first, probably the very first few days that Jacinta was allowed to go out in the field with the sheep. She's only 6 years old, and perhaps it might have even been before her birthday, just barely 6. And so that she was too young to go out and take responsibility for the flocks, but she begged and insisted to go with her older cousin Lucia, whom she kind of adored, as an older friend. And so away they went, Francisco and Jacinta, the two brothers, Lucia, their cousin, out into the field and watching sheep. And at that time, she doesn't know the date, because she didn't know how to read a calendar or anything, doesn't know what day of the week it was or anything. And again saw that white cloud. And this time it came right up to them and took the form of a young man, dazzling white and beautiful. And I'm sure you read these things. And he began teaching them about how much God loves them and loves them in the Eucharist. And after that, they would spend hours bowed down till their heads touched the ground, praying, O most holy Trinity, I adore thee. My God, I love thee in the most blessed sacrament. And of course, the other two hadn't received Holy Communion yet, but they began to understand through her the Eucharist. He came again, and she thinks it might have been July. She knows it's the very hot part of the year, and it's July and August. It's stifling over there. And he came this time. They were out in the shade by the family well behind their house when he came again. And again, he said, what are you doing? Pray, pray. The hearts of Jesus and Mary have designs on you. And in other words, don't waste your time. Can you imagine an angel telling a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, a 9-year-old to waste their time playing? But that's what he said. And of course, he taught them the prayer the adoration and belief prayer, oh my God, I believe, I adore, I trust, and I love you. And I ask pardon for those who do not believe, do not adore, do not, and the word trust is translated to hope sometimes from the Portuguese language. Do not adore, do not believe, do not hope in you nor love you. And of course, I use that prayer saying in the most blessed sacrament as an adoration prayer before receiving communion or something. Oh my God, I believe, I adore, I trust, and I love you in the most blessed sacrament. Works for me. And so that prayer then, they too learned to repeat over and over. It was in the fall then, that a couple months later, the weather had cooled very much. Lucia can't remember if school had started or not, because that didn't apply to her. and he appeared to them again. And at this time then, most of you remember, is when he brought Holy Communion to those 3 children. She said that the young man again, first he had identified himself as the angel of Portugal, later as the angel of peace, but she said it was the same person. And so he came this time carrying a chalice with a host in one hand above the chalice. And so he again taught them to adore. He this time left the chalice hanging in the air. He just let go of it, and the host above it, and bowed down, had touched the grass again, and the children too, saying, O most holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I adore thee profoundly. I offer thee the most precious body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, present in all the tabernacles of the world, in reparation for the outrages, sacrileges, and indifferences by which he is offended. And through the infinite merits of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, I beg the conversion of poor sinners. Now, before we, I got to break in there and say, here's where they were really understanding praying for other people, offering of reparation for other people's sins, They had really had started to understand that, but at this point, it was a prayer in praying for other people to be converted. He then stood, and the children again stood, and after praying that long prayer 3 times over, he took the chalice and the host out of the air, giving the host to Lucia, who had received First Communion, the contents of the chalice to the younger 2 children. And of course, back to his bowing position, praying that prayer 3 more times over again. And then, of course, I forgot the actual last words he used, but he went back to heaven. And these 3 were left in such a state of kind of transfiguration or something themselves that they don't know how many minutes, or if it might have been an hour, before they regain consciousness of the world around them. Again, going home, they had felt no impulse to share it with anybody. It was just something for those children, and they kept it to themselves. Such a beautiful experience. But they never stopped praying those adoration prayers, bowing down till their heads touched grass. Lucia writes that on some occasions they would be bent too long and they'd fall over. Can you imagine kids, how much they love to not pray? And those 3 doing that then. And so they were in that kind of a mood when May 13th came around, that they were already, praying and loving the Eucharist so much. The 2 of them couldn't wait till they'd be old enough to receive Holy Communion themselves. And so Francisco asked, I knew that was Holy Communion, the host that the angel gave to you, Lucia, but what was in the chalice? And Lucia explained that would be the precious blood that only the priest takes. Remember again that lay people never got the chalice in those days. And so Lucia said, it was Holy Communion, didn't you feel it? Well, I couldn't understand why I felt the way I did. I felt like I was with God or in God or something I can't explain. This 8-year-old boy. And so that when May 13th came around, they had been predisposed, of course, to the mystical. And when she appeared to them on May 13th, then she appeared. They never saw the angel again in anything they've ever shared with us, at least. But when Mary came, it was very different. Lucia reports, of course, that she told her 2 friends not to tell anybody that afternoon, May 13th, going back to the village with their sheep. However, little Jacinta, bubbling over as she was such a vivacious little tiny kid, smaller than most her age. And you guys have been there, all know that a grown man might be 5'5" if he's lucky. And a lot of the ladies were less than 5 feet tall at that time in that place. And here this little petite little tiny child comes home just bubbling over and can't wait to tell her mother. There was a beautiful lady from heaven, and she came down to the ground and talked to us. And that very much disappointed Lucia, because Lucia understood that nobody could believe mystical things. And then she had that figured out. And so that was a very different feeling. They didn't spend hours or even minutes after Mary's apparition praying. They were all excited about it and wondering about it and all the rest. Who might this lady be? Because she didn't tell them who she was. And so that when the grown-ups heard, well, you can imagine what happened that afternoon. Some lady from heaven. Who was it? Well, we don't know. She didn't tell us, but that's okay. She's coming back again on June 13th. She said so. We'll ask her then who she is. And that story gets harder to believe, you see, the more they tell about it. And so the wise parents and others said, look, something like this does happen, maybe like once in 100 years. It's sure not going to happen out here in our dusty little village. And anyway, it's always a saint. And you 3 don't look like saints. And no, none of us look like saints, but y'all are. Right? See, we got to think of it that way. And so it was that they went through the apparitions, being a little bit persecuted and so on. But never forgetting those angel prayers. They testify that during the summer they would go out apparition time or go to that bush when it wasn't the right day for an apparition and pray those angel prayers, bowing down until head touched the grass, to say those, O most holy Trinity, I adore thee, my God, I love thee in the most blessed sacrament, and the other two. Well, you all know the Fatima story quite well, but the visions of Mary and the messages of Mary never mention the Eucharist. Isn't it amazing? And the preparation for those, the angel never mentioned Mary. And yet they were so obviously prepared by those visits of the angel. You don't have to know Mary to love Jesus, and you don't have to know that an angel appeared, to love the Blessed Sacrament. When Mary came, not mentioning the Eucharist, they didn't forget the Eucharist. Lucia then, of course, did go to school, and the other two started school in the fall of 1918 after that miracle. However, they used to stop at St. Anthony's Church for a visit on the way going to school in the morning. Of course, their little hamlet, not even big enough to call a village, is called Algestrol, and it's close to half a mile from the church and school, which were right across from each other. So in the morning, going over there to the church for a little while to visit Jesus, school bell would ring, and it was St. Francisco, who is most of the saint of the Eucharist of the three of them. He would say, poor lonely Jesus, here he is, nobody comes to see him. We should stay with him more. You girls have to go to school, but I'm going to die soon, she promised. You all remember that part too about Fatima, where she promised to take the two of them to heaven soon. Well, how long is soon in God's time? You know, a minute as 1,000 years. But anyway, he said, I'm staying with Jesus because nobody else comes to be with Jesus. And he would stay all day in that church, you know, adoring Jesus, up here as close as he could get to the tabernacle. And don't you know, churches here in Texas, a lot of times they're too hot, and up there in Portugal, they're usually too cold, and there's neither heat nor coolers in those churches, and so never complain. Spend his day there with the Blessed Sacrament. At the end of the school day, Lucia writes in her memoirs that she'd come back to the church. There he is, still adoring, still doesn't want to go home. And now he didn't go off for lunch or anything. We'd all go off for a coffee break, wouldn't we? Is there a Starbucks just around the corner here somewhere? Not him. Stay with Jesus, on his knees. Lucia said, I used to kind of trick him since they saw her as kind of a leader and a guide, older than them. I would tell him it's out of obedience. You have to go home for your evening meal and evening chores. You must go. And then he'd quietly and dutifully go home. Wait till tomorrow to come back. And that's how they were living when the Spanish flu epidemic hit them and they got sick. And so the Eucharistic aspects of Fatima became more and more clear as the first messages that were heard and printed and sent out were the words of Our Lady and the miracle of the sun. And of course, somebody wrote an article about how that sun spinning in the sky is like the Eucharist. And I can't quote and share with you exactly how that was brought, but you can probably imagine a little about how some author could develop that thought and that theme. However, in America, a couple of the authors said that sun is thermonuclear. What we better be looking at is these atomic bombs we're inventing over here and research the idea behind that miracle of the sun and see if Our Lady seemed to be warning us of the nuclear things that we're going to do. Well, the apparitions ended with that miracle, and then the children then, with their love for the Eucharist, getting sick. Those two, there was a Spanish flu epidemic, of course, which many of you know, took about 20 million lives over a course of 1916 to 20 or 21 when it died out. And it came to New York City, and I read about a doctor in New York City monitoring it. He'd already been in Spain and had experience with it, and he warned of a terrible epidemic. These things, a virus spreads exponentially. That means that if there's 2 this week and 10 next week, there'll be 50 the following week, and whatever it is, 250 the next week or something. And he calculated that there could be 1 million deaths in New York City. But God stopped it. No medicine was ever found. These kind of things seem to run a course, they always say. People who don't understand that God's in charge say, well, these viruses, they kind of age and get old or something, and they finally die off. But those two children then, in the fall of 1918, still without First Communion, got sick, and Lucia didn't. And so they suffered quite a bit. And by February 4th of 1919, Francisco had died, and of course he was begging for Holy Communion. And finally then, the priest did come and hear his first confession a couple of days before he died. And I think it was just the day before he died, but I might be wrong. It was just very shortly before he died, he received First Communion. He was so happy. He had Jesus inside him. After the year or two that he had spent all that time adoring, he now had Jesus in him. And he died the next day. Jacinta, of course, lingered a lot longer. She was the one who felt like we must offer more suffering for the conversion of sinners. That vision of hell they had seen was so frightening. And the idea that people go to hell, and even after 1,000 years, are they still in that fire? Or they still don't burn up? Those kinds of questions. And so she wanted to suffer more because that angel and Mary had both told them that by suffering and offering reparation by means of carrying our crosses, that many sinners will be converted. And that means there won't be so many going to hell. And so she literally asked for more crosses. When she was sent off to a hospital, they removed a rib or two. No anesthetic. I don't know, maybe that's something. I know the adults were using whiskey at that time. So I don't know what they did with her. And so she suffered a lot and offered it for sinners and for devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Well, she then, Our Lady came to her and asked, do you want to come to heaven sooner or stay longer and suffer more for souls? I'll stay longer. She chose to suffer longer after the pneumonia and pleurisy had gotten so bad they'd done surgery on her. And so the lady told her that you will suffer longer and you will go to a faraway place. You will die alone. And that was the one thing that hurt her a lot, was when she had been away for that surgery, that she wasn't with her family. She was such a precautious, lively little girl in the beginning, and couldn't bear the thought of not being near her mother and her father and the rest. So she did. They shipped her off to Lisbon, and she was there in the hospital for a while. And Mother Godino was her personal nurse, was Mother Superior of the nurse sisters that were there. And so she died alone. And she too was begging for First Communion. Now this lady didn't come. And she begged to get Holy Communion today. I want my First Communion before I die, because I'm going to die tomorrow. The nurses said, you're not that sick. You're going to live longer. Don't think you're going to die. Isn't that a mistake we all make when we go on visit people on deathbeds? It's just so tempting to comfort them and tell them, don't, not yet. You're not that bad. When we really should be, I suppose, I think if you ever see me and you think it might be my deathbed, you better be shaking your finger at me instead of saying I'm going to live longer. But she said, please, please, please. The priest promised the next morning, but she died during the night without First Communion. And so, she was deprived of company from her family and so many things. But that's how you get canonized. Francisco, he was laying on his deathbed there in Algistro, and Lucia would come and visit him day after day and see him in a cold sweat and a fever, suffering, and how can a body even live any longer? He couldn't take food hardly. Have you had a bad day today? Francisco, yes. Thank you, Jesus. Today we can convert more sinners. When he was 10 years old, that's how you get canonized. What do we say on a bad day when we wake up with a headache or a fever? And so we got a ways to go, I'm sure, but I get to meet a lot of you folks that'll be there when the time comes, and he'll walk straight into heaven. And so those three children, it was so much about the Eucharist, even though Mary never mentioned the Eucharist, and so the book you read doesn't even talk about the Eucharist. But the scholars and the people, and the smart people in the church realized that and began immediately to talk about Eucharistic reparation. The whole theme of Fatima was to offer reparation vicariously for those out there that don't know they should be offering reparation. And so the theme of Eucharistic reparation did come out quite quickly. It was, I think, in the late 40s that the Dominican sisters came there and built a monastery and set up a perpetual adoration chapel. It was maybe one of the first ones outside of huge cities, maybe Lisbon or Rome or Paris or that, where they had perpetual adoration. It was Fatima, Portugal. And I know visiting there in the 80s, and some of you might have been there in the 70s, you would go over there and come in and you'd see one nun right in this position, immediately in front of the monstrance, and some seating back here with a few people in it, more on busy days. And so the Adoration Chapel at Fatima has gone on for I don't know how many years. I tried to find, I'm absolutely illiterate with computers, so I don't know how to turn one on. But I didn't get the date that chapel opened from my wife. And so there, Fatima scholars of our country was a Father Robert Fox out of South Dakota. Many of you have probably read some of his things. And he said, we can summarize Fatima. Fatima is all about reparation, and more reparation, and Eucharistic reparation. So he saw too that those prayers, Most Holy Trinity, it's all about the Eucharist that Mary taught those children and teaches us. Until now, we see these perpetual chapels around the country. And America, I'm not sure anymore, but earlier America led the world in perpetual chapels for lay people. My observation might be wrong, but I had noticed that those religious congregations, the Eucharistic-centered ones, had these chapels, perpetual chapels, in the old times when I was a kid. And after the Vatican Council, and it wasn't the blame of the Council, but the same during the time of implementation, we saw a lot of loss of religious vocations and so on, and some of those chapels closed up. So the Holy Spirit seems to have noticed that too. And he inspired some priests and stuff to encourage adoration for lay people. When I was a kid, there was no adoration for lay. I mentioned 40 hours a year, that's all. A little bit on Holy Thursday. 40 hours a year of adoration. The benediction service was a 10-minute service after the last Mass on Sunday. And all you younger people don't realize that's the way it was. Same priest would say 3 Masses, and then at the end of the last Mass, there was a 10-minute benediction. I was an altar server. And then suddenly, they started talking about adoration chapels to bring out the laity. And of course, as I said, the movement really started in America and spread across the world now. I've been in several countries, been in some of those perpetual chapels that are going on. And I think that adoration chapel is what keeps us away from the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Because are we as bad as them? Well, we still have 10 just men, and they apparently didn't, but we sure have a lot of sin. And but you see, God, he's got that big fly swatter up there, and he's used it before. And he asked the Sodom and Gomorrah people, or the time of Noah. And the only reason he hasn't used it on us, he can't, when people are kneeling in front of that sacrament. People like yourselves, doing your holy hours. You're saving America, I think. And so I want to thank you all for that. And I encourage you, of course, to look again at the Fatima messages and so on, because it gives you such encouragement, realizing how influential and powerful you are spending that hour with Jesus. You're hidden from the world. The world doesn't know it, but you're the ones fixing the world from its problems. And so, God bless you. And I don't know, I got a couple minutes left. If you have a question or something, but somebody's going to cut me off in a couple minutes anyway. So I appreciate the invitation to come over here a few minutes. And the statue currently is, help me, I can't even, a Vietnamese parish tonight, I think it's in Garland.
Do you know their signal? Questions?
No question, okay.
Okay, no questions? All right, then we have, oh, we have presentation. Oh, good.
Thank you.
Yes.
We'd like to present you with just a little token of appreciation. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
I didn't expect it. I hope your nice little Eucharistic conference and effort here multiplies again and again and develops into something bigger. The world needs more of what you're doing today. Thank you.
Do we have questions? No questions? I do believe we have, right? Yes. Okay, go ahead. So,
we have a few more. We have a few more minutes before the break, so I'm going to explain a little thing which I didn't have time to go through. This conference is intended to be by donation only, so that everybody can attend. We want to have more people. But there are already enough donations to cover all the costs. That means you don't need to make additional donation. For the people who made the donation, there is an intention that we donate instead to Jesuit mission. And this is a picture of Eucharistic adoration at a university in Serbia. In America, we have built new church, but it is very hard to find people to adoration. And in Serbia, they don't have a church. This is the university. So the priest was the director of the chapter of the university. But it doesn't have a chapel. So when they hold mass, they had to borrow a room from the university. There was a large university, but it was extremely small in our scale. There are 100 universities in Serbia. So each of them is a very small population. They were talking about 1,000 new students every year, so it's a really small university. At that time, after the talk, they said they want to have a mass and have adoration. Because after talk adoration, it's better try adoration. Okay? And I was surprised to see almost 200 students. They borrowed an examination room. That's a room they had and do adoration. So the priest, and the reason they had a mantra was because it was ordained. So that was the very first adoration for those students at the time. That is a very touching experience. We don't see that many young people in adoration in our own country. So when we support them, the prayer will also support us. Okay. So for the donation, this is already approved by the Jesuit mission, okay? But it is not go through the church. That means you should write a check to the Jesuit mission according to instruction on the website, okay? You do that and do whatever you want. And then the Jesuit mission is in the United States, okay? So they will give you a receipt. If you need a receipt, they will give you a receipt for tax purposes, and then the money they will forward, and you have to put down and note this is for the adoration chapel in Serbia. So there are already enough people for perpetual adoration. If 200 students are there in 1 hour, that means they take turn. So that is what they're trying to do. Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's take a break and then please check the schedule. We will be back in what the choir sings. So we'll be back and we have one more witness, and then after that we'll be preparing for Mass. So Mass is at so just make sure that whatever you are having food, 1 hour before Mass, Eucharistic fast, and some waters for the kids and the So I guess it's 1, 2, 3, break.